The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, and education. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and joining us on today's program is Gregory Weston, an attorney with the firm of Thatcher, Prophet & Wood, one of the young African Americans who've entered the legal profession. Greg, glad to have you with us on today's African American Legends. And could you begin by just telling us what motivated you to become an attorney?
That's a good question. I guess it started perhaps in high school. Back in those days, before lawyer bashing, lawyers were seen to be a pretty noble profession, and in African American community, lawyers were often the vanguard of social change in a lot of different areas.
NAACP, Legal Defense Fund.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of my early heroes were lawyers from Charlie Houston to Thurgood Marshall, Paul Robeson. There are a lot of, I think, African Americans who contributed to change this country.
You mentioned some names pretty fast because you and I understand them, but you said that Charles Houston. You tell us why he is so important.
Well, a lot of people know Thurgood Marshall, but he was one of a long list of attorneys going from the turn of the century through the 60s who were involved in change, and quite heroic figures, and Charles Houston was one of them. And these people would go into the South with not a lot of fanfare, but with a lot of risk, and take on very difficult cases. Often they were lynching cases, or there are other cases where there were defendants who didn't have adequate representation, and try to help balance the scales a little bit more. They were obviously very imbalanced at those times. And through the courts, we realized that there were ways to redress some of the very difficult situations that our communities face throughout the South and throughout the country. And this use of the law as a social agent for change was very powerful influence to me. Well,
Charles Houston was the dean of the Howard Law School,
right.
And it was he, even before Thurgood Marshall, who crafted the strategy of using the United States Constitution, particularly the 14th Amendment, to get the rights for African Americans, as you said, going into the Deep South, defending people against various scurrilous charges, trying to get lynching stopped and the like. And that's a generation of lawyers that you come out of. You probably went to school, what, in 70s, 80s?
Exactly.
And you were in touch with that. Now, many of the African-American lawyers with outstanding, what law school did you attend?
Columbia Law School.
Columbia Law School. That's where Paul Robeson went to law school.
Correct. And I went to Howard undergrad.
And went to Howard,
so I was very, very much aware of the great tradition that Howard Law School had in shaping a lot of constitutional law today.
And of course, from your home, Dr. Emma Rand Weston, one of the great leaders, African-American community, pastor of St. Philip's Church, helped to start Carver Savings Bank, Greater Harlem Nursing Home. So you just learned this right from the day you came on this planet.
Well, it's, it certainly was part of my upbringing and being aware. And one of the concerns I have is that a lot of that struggle is not part of the body of knowledge that a lot of the younger generation has at their fingertips, and that's unfortunate because I think a lot of those same issues are still there, maybe manifest differently, but there's been great progress, but we still, as you know, have a long way to go.
Now, as I said, many of the lawyers, African-American lawyers who got this excellent training from top law schools in the 70s, 80s, sometimes the 90s, have moved into corporate law and to the big law firms. Two parts of that. One, the big law firms didn't hire African Americans years ago. People like Paul Robeson couldn't even get hired.
Correct.
And then the strategies, in a sense, have changed because of the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65, and the modifications of the Civil Rights Act in the '80s. Many of the legal challenges to open opportunity have sort of receded, and you're down into technical things like defending affirmative action. So now we got more African American lawyers, better education. They go to the corporate and the business world. What impact do you think first of all, what impact has it had on you in terms of your decisions for career, and what impact do you think that has on other African Americans who are coming out of law school?
Well, myself, I did some time actually with NAACP Legal Defense Fund while I was in school, my second summer, and that was a great experience for a lot of different reasons. But I think you're correct, a lot of the challenges are different than the challenges that NAACP Legal Defense Fund historically has dealt with, and a lot of their efforts are trying to maintain some of the precedents they established against a sea of erosion through legislative and judicial means. But at the same time, a lot of things were opened up through those legal challenges and legal precedents and legislation that came out largely in the 60s and somewhat in the 70s. And I think much of the community and the lawyers reflect this is now focusing on economic as well as political progress is the key to getting our communities to the next level. I think you have to have the political and civil rights framework to be in the mix. And obviously, if you're not even in the law firms, if you're not, the executives and the companies are not reflecting our communities, you're not in the ball game. But you're starting to see some numbers, and it's still very, very small, unfortunately. But you're starting to see some numbers, in mainstream corporate America, and I think that's our next challenge for our generation and generation to follow. How do you make meaningful impact economically on a community level, on a national level, and international level? And I think that's where, appropriately, a lot of the focus is for my generation.
And in the days past, when African Americans were involved with the legal system, it was usually to confront discrimination or to deal with unfair charges to African Americans. Now, in your firm, you handle all kinds of matters, matters which probably in most instances don't directly impinge on African Americans. Although when you do corporate law, since corporations affect practically everybody in the world, they are going to affect African Americans. How do you find your acceptance from your white colleagues when you begin to enter a law firm and begin to take the same kind of challenges and problems that they have? How has it been?
Well, it's often been an education process for the others because, as you well know, this country is still very segregated racially, and even well-meaning non-African Americans often don't have much interaction with people other than themselves throughout their whole life, where they live, where they've gone to school, etc. So all of a sudden they're adults in a corporate environment, and they're interfacing with people unlike themselves for the first time on a peer basis.
That's true.
Not someone working for them or someone who they, and so often it's a bit of education to get to that comfort level for them to realize there's a lot more in common than not in common with people that superficially look different and may have a different cultural perspective. And it's usually a fairly benign process. I mean, sometimes it gets a little bit more hostile as people's ignorance is set in very stereotypical ways. But the things are there, and the culture is very much dominated by either WASPs or Jews or other groups that we're not part of. So you're part of a education process for them as well as dealing with your own agenda.
That must have quite an impact on the individual. Myself, having been one of the first African-American professors at a major white university, New York University, gone through this process of integration and transition and upward mobility, but there must be a certain amount of introspection that you have to have about yourself and about your commitment to race and to confront what you say is benign, sometimes not so benign, ignorance about what African Americans are like.
Yeah, and it is part of the job, and
well said.
And that's our parents knew that, and you don't spend a lot of time. You do find support mechanisms, informal and formal, of other people dealing with the same issues, and you find opportunities to let your hair down and share experiences and find how other people cope with issues that are pretty similar. The good news is that I've seen a difference in 15 years I've been out of law school in the very few numbers. When I first came out of law school, I was the first black that had been hired by a 300-person law firm in several years. So it was a bit of a test case, and there was still a couple of years before they hired some others. The firm I'm in now, you know, the numbers aren't great, but still, certainly in the junior levels, you're starting to see a lot more representation. African Americans, actually Africans from Ghana, from Nigeria, you're starting to see, you never saw that before. Obviously the Asians and some Hispanic representation, you know, that's something new as well. The bigger issue within law firms as well as corporate America in general is the advancement. You're starting,
the glass ceiling.
Yeah. Before you didn't have anybody. I mean, you're starting to get people in the front door.
Right.
And the question is, you know, matriculating and getting to the next level, be it partnership in a law firm, be it promotion in a corporate setting, and those challenges are still there. And if you look at the numbers, you know, at the top of the funnel as opposed to the bottom, there's a great weeding out process. And you know, there's been a lot of discussion in the majority bar associations in New York City and other places about how do you deal with hiring, getting the numbers greater, and a little less discussion about promotion, but people are realizing that that's still a challenge.
Well, so much of movement in business and politics, entertainment, law has to do with personal relationships, what we call the buddy system, the old boy system, the no nepotism system. Those are things that obviously are intervening variables between black and white as you begin to move up. Obviously your social skills, your ability to tackle difficult problems with the same level, excuse me, or even greater competence in some of your colleagues. For example, I'm sure you were assigned to projects where your competence and your intellectual capacity makes you a preferred attorney in dealing with it. And that's true with anyone along the way. Similarly, as more people become involved with blacks in business, not only in the United States, but in Africa, Latin America, etc., there is some advantage to having someone who's African background working with other Africans. I'm sure that that is true in certain instances. So the question is, in getting your assignments, how are your assignments given to you and how do you respond to them? Are they random? Is it some specialization? Is it geographical? How do you get your assignments and how do you respond to that?
Well, it varies. You're right. There is often kind of a test case. People want to know your competence, but after you prove that, you hopefully get beyond that. In terms of my own assignments, it's a combination of work I've generated through my own clients, and basically client calls, you jump, and my role is often giving assignments to others in the firm. But where I'm working for other partners, it's an interesting question because people don't want to have valued clients in the hands of someone they don't have confidence in. So it's somewhat of a vote of confidence if you're working for someone else's important client. There have been times where I was all of a sudden put on a very high-profile situation, and I was very happy about that. And at some point, a little down the road, I realized that there was African-American on the client side who would send out subtle or not so subtle messages that lack of seeing anybody like that person was a negative. And I think that generally corporate America is realizing that being stuck in complete institutional racism has a cost because you're jeopardizing potential increased business through clients and customers who want to see people, who either look like them or have their own similar concerns that they can relate to. So that's certainly part of it, that there's some enlightenment, but there's also recognition economically that there's a cost to continue in the old ways.
I think the Texaco case, probably more than any, publicly identifies the fact that racism has existed in major corporations and that it is unacceptable. It's unacceptable from a moral point of view, but most specifically it's unacceptable from a business point of view.
Absolutely.
So that means that African American attorneys have some additional responsibilities other than just being a good lawyer. They have the responsibility of communicating the ethic, as it were, of fairness, of equality, of opportunity, which then leads to the role of young African American attorneys and business executives in terms of the relationship to the black community. It is said too often that some of the young African Americans who go to Ivy League and prestige institutions and get into the major corporations and law firms sort of forget where they came from. I know very specifically that's not your case because you are a leader in a group that many of us participate in to try to improve conditions in the Harlem community. But in general, what do you think is the validity of that accusation, and what do you think some of the African American young professionals are doing to change that perception?
Probably is some validity to that for the simple reason in some cases that to get on that ladder and progress takes so much time and commitment that there are certain limited hours that people can put efforts to other things. So some people just have their nose to the grindstone. But having said that, you know, if one's compass is pointing in the right way, you find time to do things. And I think it depends upon the individual. If they recognize their real role, you know, in the bigger picture, that they, you know, as someone once said, we're not born on third base and thought they hit a triple.
Very well said.
They recognize that other people help get them where they are, that some kind of reaching back is automatic. It's a question of how that's manifest. People are getting involved in community-based organizations. There was an effort by the United Way that started a couple of years ago that got me involved in non-for-profit. One of many I'm involved in, but there was a recognition that there were a lot of community-based organizations that had almost lily white boards servicing mainly minority people in the community, and there's a recognition that there's you know, some imbalance here. You know, we really need some people from these communities who have a better idea of what's going on, who can relate better, and certainly provide a voice at the board level to some of these service-based nonprofits. So you're starting to see that. You're starting to see, you know, mentor programs where people take on, you know, a little brother, a little sister, in some kind of role where there's a, you know, a one-on-one type of ongoing relationship. There are efforts to go to schools where people go speak to kids, talk about what they're doing, and I think, you know, it is still a big challenge because often in the communities that are most desperate, there's the least opportunity to see alternative role models. And how do you get these alternative role models to those kids to see that, well, if I want to advance, there have to be some, besides the traditional, very, you know, public media role models of athletics and sports and things like that, but there are other ways to get where they want to be. I mean, that's a continued challenge, and part of it is where people are living. They're starting to see more people moving back to inner cities from the suburbs, but still, they're, you know, as every other group has done, you know, you live in the best neighborhood and go to the best schools that you've had the good fortune to be afforded.
Right.
So even with that, I think it's going to be a give, and you still have to build those bridges, and I think that's going to be a continued problem, because I think not only just in the African-American community, the rest of this country, the divide between haves and have-nots is getting greater. The middle class is becoming more of an endangered species, and, you know, communities traditionally, because of segregation, everybody was together. As those walls came down.
Role model right next door to you.
Yeah, the funeral director, the doctor, the lawyer, the accountant, you know.
The subway operator, the porter, they all lived within proximity of each other.
That's right, and as those who've had some ability to, you live out the American dream and live what they want to, those left behind are even in a more desperate situation than we had maybe 40, 50 years ago. And there are a lot of obvious systemic things that go along with that, but I think it still comes down to economic empowerment and getting some type of flow of economics into those communities.
Well, some corporations, some law firms actually develop networks among their African American employees and some of the other employees to go to schools, to mentor, to work in various projects, moot court projects and the like. The 100 Black Men, which I was former president of, is now headed by Luther Gatling, does a number of those things with our mentoring program. But to what extent do you think someone viewing this program who's an African American executive said, gee, that's a great idea. Let me go back to my company and see if we can organize some of the folks to either doing some work time or after work to go and serve? Because one of the things that I've observed is as we've had this burgeoning number of African American executives and MBAs and lawyers and so on, many of them don't know some of us who have been in the vineyard toiling for a long period of time, usually because of age, sometimes because of geography. But I find, from my experience, that reaching out to the Gregory Westons of the world, if you reach out to them and identify a way in which they can return and help their community, they will. And I would think that many of the corporations and law firms ought to take that as an affirmative challenge.
Well, I think you identified a very real issue that people just don't know. And one of the benefits of the breakfast group we discussed is that often, those who've been around the track a few times before my age group get a chance to realize that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. That a lot of the things that we should be focusing on, people have been looking at for a long time. And there are some ways that we can contribute very meaningfully that are out there, and often it's just the information flow. So I think, number one, communication within our community is critical. And even if you can't get corporate sponsorship for the kind of agenda you mentioned, I think it's not a great cost to do that. I think it's just organization. And I think existing groups such as 100 Black Men, such as the Met Bar, NBA, and other fraternal and business organizations could spearhead those kind of things, and often they are doing that.
With the challenge to affirmative action now, we see in the University of California the number of students who enter the law school dropped from 88 to 1 as the affirmative action criteria were challenged. What do you think is the antidote to that? What are some of the things that we can do? The idea is you study harder. Well, that may be true, but many times African Americans go to schools that are not funded as well, et cetera. But what are some of the antidotes to this attack on affirmative action, particularly in terms of getting into professional schools and medical schools? What responsibility do you have? What responsibility I have? What responsibility does society have?
Well, that is a real critical issue, and unfortunately, the prognosis is not looking better. Given the funnel of cases that are now coming before the Supreme Court, and the way the Supreme Court has been leaning in recent years toward looking at some of these cases. I think there is a general perception among many in this country that past wrongs are past, and they're not corrected by present wrongs. And there are often many cases where it's very easy to set up Exhibit A for what's wrong with affirmative action. But I think President Clinton was correct in his view that we should mend it, not end it. I think you don't take the worst case scenario and say, well, we should do away with affirmative action. And I think a lot of people get caught up who don't know in the rhetoric of those who don't have our community's interest in heart, who kind of paint everything in the same brush as quotas and things like that, which is utter nonsense, but it gets people's attention. And again, when people are struggling, it's an easy target for the white community often to latch on to. In terms of strategies, I think we have to recognize that affirmative action is going to have limits going forward, no matter what happens. I don't think it's going to die, but I think it's going to be much more prescribed. I think you're going to see more income testing as opposed to racial-related testing for need. But I think in terms of academics, we need to, one, get away from mythology that there's merit and then there's like the way we got in. I mean,
Yeah, right.
you know, it's never been that way. You know, these schools are full of alumni children and people with different gifts. It's not just about LSAT or SAT scores. So we didn't invent, you know, looking beyond that.
Preference of some sort.
Exactly. But, you know, in terms of identifying talent, which is the whole purpose of looking at grades, looking at SAT scores, and potential talent, perhaps the schools can look at broader issues to identify realistic abilities to track potential talent in a broader sense than what we've been doing. And that, I think, will benefit everybody. I don't think anything that benefits us is going to necessarily be to the detriment of others. And obviously you got to deal with systemic problems in educational systems in our communities that you can't cure junior year in high school. But to get to that, there are a lot of very bright, talented people, and it's been proven by those who, quote unquote, came in with lesser test scores who did remarkably well, you know, matriculated and professionally. So I think, you know, we need to be a little more creative in identifying the talent.
Well, I certainly hope that you'll be one of those African-American lawyers that help to develop this creativity, because your perception and analysis department is right on target. Today on African-American Legends, we've been talking with Gregory Weston, who's attorney with Thatcher, Prophet & Wood, and we were talking about the opportunities and the role of African-Americans in the legal profession. Thanks for being with us today, Greg.
Thanks, Russ.